Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and with all the turbulence going on in the world, and even the weather changing to cold, we have all kinds of difficulties, which, however, we shall overcome, so we hope. You may, I can see that most of you were here last month when we really began our journey into the mythic reality, and so in certain ways, by way of the reviewing of the work of some of the outstanding people in the 20th century who have contributed to the deeper and we might say the transformational and depth psychological view of myths, we will take a look at the work of several other people this month. The one tonight being Heinrich Zimmer, who is certainly not very greatly known. One of the main reasons for that being, first of all, that unlike Joseph Campbell, he was German, although at the very end of his life he managed to, I suppose one might say, escape from the largely Hitlerian Europe at that time, and consequently very few of his few portions of his contribution have really become known or were even published in this country. Had it not been for his friend and admiring disciple Joseph Campbell, whose work we were looking at last time, and probably almost all of Zimmer's contribution would have been lost, because Campbell inherited his papers when Zimmer died in New York, and then laboriously and with the help of one noted Jungian editor, Ralph Mannheim, compiled and edited and commented upon a good deal of the material that he found. And so such contributions of Heinrich Zimmer as we have available are almost entirely due to the rescue work of his disciple Joseph Campbell. But reaching back a little further, it may be useful once again to reiterate, perhaps in slightly different words, that what we are dealing with in these discussions is the fact that a certain type of I won't even call it literature, because certainly the early forms of it were handed on by verbal transmission and only later on became a literature. But let's say that this genre of which we call the myth has had a tremendous role that it played throughout human history, beginning with very primitive times of probably the ancient shamans sitting in their caves, the art of, how should we put it, inwardly and spiritually inspired and motivated storytelling became of great importance. and taking on various expressions and various forms. This art of storytelling continued, and always adapting itself to some degree to the demands of the time, it continued to serve the same purpose that it served originally. And I think that's fairly easy to pinpoint, because the purpose was the same throughout history. And what was that purpose? It was the telling and reliving and revivifying within the storyteller and the people, the audience or the reader of the storyteller, of one great story. And what story is that? Is it the story of Jesus? Is it the story of Muhammad? Is it the story of Rama and Krishna, or some of the modern gurus? Only in a secondary sense. In a primary sense, it is the story of each and every human being. And in that regard, it may be useful to recollect that there is certainly a very powerful instinct or impulse, or whatever we may call it, in humanity to change, toward the possibility and the possible benefits of change. To this day, we find probably primarily politicians repeating the slogan of change in order to collect attention and subsequently votes. Yet there are varieties, at least two great varieties of that change, which are not synchronized with each other, and which are actually in a somewhat antagonistic position toward each other. One is the constant drive that we find in humanity as far back as we can observe, of external change. We are dissatisfied with what is around us in one way or the other. We may be physically dissatisfied with it, we may be psychologically dissatisfied with it, and in the latter category there may be emotional and intellectual factors of dissatisfaction, but because of dissatisfaction, which often has been regarded as creative because of what it leads to, it has motivated people to be interested in change. But parallel with this drive for external change, there has also always been a longing, a deep desire for what might be called a different kind of change, and which has been, especially since the times of the alchemists who practiced a particular symbolic system of change, has become known as transformation. And this transformation is the one that we're interested in, because it involves a very profound and ultimately really all-encompassing creative change of the individual within the individual himself. Now, external change and its advocates and its practitioners we have always with us. Right now, I think we are experiencing, to the extent that we are responsive to the ubiquitous media, one of those many attempts. And these are changed by warfare, by one people attacking another, by one country attacking another, by the change of geographical borders, and often by the implanting or the attempted implanting of one culture into another, so it might replace it, and this sort of external change. It has always been with us, and in the majority of instances, perhaps even including the present world situation, of which, however, I think we still have only a minimum of reliable information, reliable data. It has always resulted at some point in very unhappy situations for some of the people involved, for massacres, for battles, for the tormenting of other human beings, and often the creating of situations in various parts of the world which have been by no means an improvement upon the previous situation, but which signify an unfortunate and painful deterioration. So let's say the record of external changes brought about by humans on a large scale, on a historical scale, is a very bad one. Whether we look at Julius Caesar, or whether we look at Napoleon, or at in even more dark and bloody realm of Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, and folk like that, the external changes which they brought about or greatly facilitated were painful, bloody, the cause of sorrow and misery, often of an enduring nature. And one needs to observe that, on the other hand, quietly and rather unobtrusively, all throughout history there runs another movement toward change. And that movement is interior in origin, and to a major extent interior in its effects, and it is also very, very effective and profound and lasting in nature. My first encounter with what can justly be called transformation was with a rather unattractive creature called the silkworm. Now, you know, silkworms, as I mentioned, obviously they make silk. But the way they make it is of an interesting and curious nature. So in the part of northern Hungary where I lived, there was a move, let's say, by the governments to cultivate silkworms because they would increase the local industry. And when one looked a little bit at what went on the mulberry trees, because that is what the silkworms eat, and boy do they eat it. When you come near the mulberry trees, even there is 1 or 2 trees and the silkworms are there, you can hear those little fellows eat. Chomp, chomp, chomp. Oh, there's a buzz going on, and it is the way they eat the silkworm. They eat the mulberry leaves. In any event, after they have eaten their fill and have grown to a certain size, not to spend too much time on them, in this case, they do something strange that other insects do also. They spin themselves into a cocoon, all right? And then after they are in the cocoon, after a certain period of time, if one opens the cocoon, what you find in it, or if you wait till the creature comes out, is something entirely different from the worm that was there initially. It's no longer has the shape, the texture, the behavior, the diet of a worm-like creature, but instead of that, it has become a flying insect, somewhat like a rather humble-looking and miserable butterfly, or something of that sort, but every portion of the silkworm has undergone a transformation. And moreover, if I'll conclude the silkworm odyssey now. It's not really mythically very inspiring, I'm afraid, but it demonstrates a principle that when the worm has made a cocoon around itself, it doesn't just undergo changes like grow wings or something of that sort, but it completely dissolves into what even biological books have called a black goo. A black goo. It's not a very scientific term, but it's like a mass of semi-liquid material. Has no shape whatsoever, and this reconstitutes itself eventually into the silk, which is no longer a silkworm, but an insect with wings that flies and then goes elsewhere and deposits its eggs therein. So it undergoes a complete change, so much so that the new product bears no similarity whatsoever to the early one. Now, it has taken on a completely new form, transformatio, a change of form. Now, curiously and happily, this is a metaphor for something really much more attractive than what I just tried to describe, namely the interior, the psychological, the psycho-spiritual transformation of the human being. Of the human being at the level of psyche, which is really the Greek word for soul, mind, shall we say, the non-physical component of our nature. And therefore, it is the just conclusion of any meaningful observation of history, of the history of the human race, of the human genus, that a very complete and ultimately very important and beneficial transformation, a changing of form in the interior recesses of the human mind, in the human psyche, can take place. And indeed, that it seems to be a task, a job that is implicit in human nature, and that along with various drives and instincts and proclivities that we may have over exterior or more interior nature, there is a drive, there is a proclivity, a movement within us that is directed toward transformation of the psyche. And this transformation, in turn, is, as certainly we'll come to some of the data about him, the great Professor Heinrich Zimmer had been very close to and mentioned very greatly, namely that such a transformation is, among other things, is really the, shall we say, it's the, hopefully, the joyous future of the human soul. If we want to envision a future for ourselves that is more exciting, that is happier, that is joyous, which is one of the terms that Zimmer used, that brings us joy, it is this internal transformation. So this is, I think, it's a very important difference between this internal transformation and the external change, that the external change hardly ever brings us any lasting and productive joy. It may look that way to begin with. Oh, if I change this or if I change that, then I'm going to be happy. When it happens, however, such happiness, such joy does not happen. However, at the same time, I think beginning with the origins of humanity, beginning with the very primitive times of the human race, we find that people have derived joy, happiness, and excitement of a pleasant nature, which is just a synonym for the former, from this kind of transformation. And when we seek for the modalities, the helpful agencies as to what might facilitate and ultimately bring about this kind of transformation within us, a very prominent position along those lines is the stimulating story. The story that stimulates and awakens the transformational elements within us, and that therefore brings it forward and allows us to undergo this internal transformation. It allows us to respond to a late previously latent and still powerfully present interior desire toward such a transformation. Now, that being the case, we state once again that one of the descriptions, one of the names that was given to this transformational process beginning in very ancient times has been the myth, the story. Actually, we might say that the mythic account enlivens the transformational desire, the transformational instinct, and the move toward transformation in the individual, and thereby brings about various steps of such transformation. At the same time, let's say the attitude of humans toward what might be the means, or at least the facilitating agents of transformation, has varied greatly. As we have noticed in our past discussions, certainly the people who probably in our cultural context, which is Mediterranean in origin, were most or are most closely associated in the common mind, and therefore also in literature and elsewhere, are the Greeks. The Greeks certainly were the ones whom we know at least who gave us the most eloquent, and by way of their great poets, the most eloquent literary testimony of the nature and the content of myth. Yet the Greeks themselves, if you study the ancient Greece, you will find there were three different ways in which the populace of Greece approached their own mythology. They are very different from each other. The first one is, we might say, the most primitive one, but still quite effective in terms of stimulating interior transformational feelings, which was on the nature of the simple people who took the mythic stories, let's say, of the gods and the goddesses and the various interactions of humans with the divinities and all of that. They took these as literal, factual history. They believed that the gods were persons, somewhat like humans, who interacted with humans, and the result of much of that interaction then went into the mythology. That's the first kind of understanding. And when it comes right down to it, that wasn't such a bad understanding, because even when a transformational mythology is understood or misunderstood in a factual matter, it can still produce desirable results. Probably the most eminent example that we can find in our culture to that effect is Christianity. As Joseph Campbell has pointed out, every religion is based on myth. and he had great disagreements with fellow academics, particularly over religious disposition, who didn't like the idea that he said that the Bible is myth. Yet, let's say, this myth, these stories that we call the Old Testament and the New Testament, have caused considerable interior transformations, ecstasies, a great deal of delight, and while they were still generally accepted, rather good behavior on the part of a lot of people. Once the, let's say, the myth of the Ten Commandments fell into oblivion and disrepute, and people began to behave rather in a less desirable fashion than before, which indicates that these stories have done them some good. And at the deeper level of religious emotion, and then added to that, let's say, a participation of consciousness in transcendence, in realms beyond this world, was certainly greatly facilitated with the, let's say, the myth upon which the Christian religion, and for that matter, many others too, were based. However, let's say the Greeks were also a very mental, a very intellectual bunch. After all, we have inherited all of their philosophy. We have inherited Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and pre-Socratics and everybody. All of this fancy mental work was done by the Greeks. So the intellectual side of the Greek character, on the other hand, tried to derive philosophical, intellectual meaning and doctrine out of the myth. It tried to, as somebody called it, see it as a tale with tales with a moral, which would impel you to maybe experience salutary changes in your behavior, things like that. That's the mental that was the Greek mental approach. But standing up against the tale with a moral is the myth with a meaning. Now, meaning here cannot be understood and should not be understood the way most people misinterpret it. That means that this means that, but rather in a much more overall, in a much more general sense, that the, let's say, the story of the Greek gods and so forth brings about an interior understanding, a meaningful view of existence and of life in the individual when it is contemplated and understood in a profound manner. Now, it is this very last category that gave rise to and certainly became really the essential ingredient in the mysteries. As you are probably aware of that, but it's a good way to remember it, that in Greek the mystes is somebody who closes his eyes, which means that he veils his eyes from the distractions of the external world. So you make yourself blind to the distractions of the physical world. In our times, I think it would be primarily turning off the television set and turning off the computer. You know, this would be a way of withdrawing from the distractions of the external world. But so the Greeks, probably inspired by the Egyptians mostly, or to a major extent, the Greeks had developed let's say, a systematized living conscious participation in the transformative myth. And these were the practices of the mysteries. Almost without exception, at least the ones that we learned about, being always based on the myth of a particular deity, with probably or deities, more than one deity. Probably the most famous, because it had the longest historical endurance or life, the Eleusinian mysteries were based on the myth of Persephone, the goddess Persephone, and her mother Demeter, and the various difficulties and the solving of the difficulties that these two goddesses encountered, by Persephone being abducted into the underworld. Pluto did things like that. In fact, he still is upon us as the great astrological transit right now. In fact, I think this week was a triple transit, and I'm not an astrologer, but I listened to my astrologer friend on the telephone. That was within the larger transit of Pluto. There was a transit of Mars as a transit of Venus, right about the time when the war broke out in Ukraine, as I call it. So, synchronicities, yes, but meaningful at the same time. But let us say that was the mysteries which had an immense psycho-spiritual effect upon their initiates. Very famous and very truthful people like Cicero and others have given testimony to the fact that once somebody became a full initiate, say, of the Eleusinian mysteries, they became a very different person, and they all completely lost their fear of death. Now that's a big result. That's a big thing to happen. One wonders that we would have had some kind of contemporary Eleusinian mystery in the last few years to chase the fear of death away. Instead of that, we practiced all kinds of means whereby to invoke the fear of death. So that's the difference between ourselves and the ancient Greeks. The Greeks knew how to get rid of it. We know how to bring it into our lives. So I wonder who is the more admirable. In any event, let's see, that was the highest flowering of the transformational effect of myth that we are aware of in history, because compared to the numbers of the populace, a very large number of people became initiates of these mysteries and profited from the results that ensued in their nature, in consciousness, to a very great and very marked degree. Now, these are things that you are probably aware of already, and you say that, gee whiz, why did I go out in this cold weather and come here in order to hear about it again? But let's say this should lead in our discussion to something else, namely, is there a realm of activity of the mind, of course, primarily of the soul, in our culture that could be considered to be the equivalent, at least to some extent and degree, of the mysteries? Well, I would suggest once again, and I certainly have done so before, that the answer to that is yes. And the one that I personally have felt had probably been the most effective and has produced very helpful results in many different regards and many different fields, has been in the field of psychology. Now you might feel let down by that. Oh yes, so you think that the head shrinks are the heirs of the ancient mysteries? Well, I think some of them were and are, although perhaps not all. But in order not to show my Jungian claws a little bit too much, I must admit that, let's say, Jung's great predecessor and original associate, Sigmund Freud, had already started that. You know, Freud was a great student of ancient mythology and a great admirer in his own way, let's say, of the mythological figures of antiquity. You know, I had occasion at one time in my life to be very much occupied with all the life circumstances and family and everything of Sigmund Freud, but even though I was always mostly an admirer of Jung, but the details don't matter. But if you had gone to Siggy Freud's big city apartment in Vienna, in Berggasse 19, I think it was, and come to his office, one thing you would have found was a gigantic desk. The desk was so big that it almost occupied the whole room, well, at least half of the room, a great big doggone thing. A friend of mine who was somewhat of a carpenter one time constructed a desk of similar proportions for moi. And the problem with it was I was happy to have a Sigmund Freud-sized desk, but I was it was placed in a rather small room, and I had a difficulty getting around the desk when I was moving in the room. In any event, the reason I mentioned the desk is, of course, not only because that was the desk on which Freud wrote all his many books, and whether you like Freudian psychology or not, the man was a doggone good writer. Excellent writer. You read him in German, it's a delight. You read Jung, it's a delight for other reasons, but not necessarily for style. In any event, but primarily because on the desk there stood a large number of statues of the ancient gods, Egyptian gods, Greek gods, Roman gods. I don't think he went as far as over to India and things like that, but statues all over. And when questioned about this, Freud would say, well, the stories of these beings tell us a great deal about psychology and about the human psyche. And you need to remember that the first big complexes that he spoke of, wrote about, named after Oedipus and Electra. You see? So he knew his mythology. Now, as the new science, as he liked to call it, although the scientists never agreed with him, but they are spoilers. They almost always are. In any event, then when Carl Jung came along, he extended, let us say, the interest that Jung had kindled in the ancient gods, in the ancient myths, and so forth, and he extended it to the concept, if we can call it that, of the archetypes, of the ancient image. Ancient in the sense that it is native not just to you and I, but to humanity. And that these ancient images in turn, when contemplated, when their stories are internalized, when they cause a certain kind of emotional excitement within us, they in turn become the agents of within the psychological processes of our insights, of our foresight, and maybe our intellectual processes and so forth, and ultimately, of course, with Jung, you might say, of our spiritual, psycho-spiritual transformation. So here is how we inherited the myths of old, and of course there were intermediate stages, and we dealt with the Arthurian, with quite a few of the Arthurian myths last month and so forth, because the ability of the human to reach out for the transformative myth and to be influenced thereby, influenced in a transformative way, was always present. It did not die with the ancient gods. There was a why do I think of something and then I say I shouldn't have thought of it. In any event, there was a late 19th century Russian author by the name of Dmitry Merezhkovsky, and he wrote some fabulously exciting and historical novels. And the first one is about Julian the Apostate and the death of the gods. It's about that historical period. Very, 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 very fine book. In any event, what the very title declares, he wrote that the ancient gods died with the coming of Christianity, the death of the gods. But of course, if he had been talking to, and he was rather anti-Christian himself, Merezhkovsky. But let's say somebody might have told him, that an ancient Greek might have told him, but Mr. Merezhkovsky, the important thing about the gods is that they don't die. And the gods are the immortals. They are the ones up on Mount Olympus. You and I are the ones who die, but the gods don't die. So maybe he shouldn't have used that as a title, as a death of the gods. But let us say obviously the gods, the archetypes, the ones who carry the psychic energy that causes our transformation to not die. And they are as much present now as they ever been. And one of the people who I would say in a singularly effective and insightful manner has rediscovered them and brought them back to life in terms of the psyches of humans, was C.G. Jung. So we might say, and of course he was, like all those people, were also was very interested in the transformative nature of myth, because Jung discovered quite early in his career that the human psyche, the human soul, human mind, whatever you want to call it, is not a static, confined being, but rather that it is involved in a creative and transformative change. We all have within us the internal drive for this transformation, and he came to call it ultimately the individuation process, because the transformation itself results in a unification of the psyche and the various constellations and complexes therein. So I would say, Jung was the modern rediscoverer of the nature and the stories and the creative role of the gods of antiquity in contemporary guise. And this, of course, put him into the how should I put it, into the particular division of humanity and of the scientists and intellectuals and people of that sort who might say caught the whiff, the spiritual fragrance of the mysteries, and saw them in their own way as being present in the myths of antiquity and in the myths of a later period too, as an inducement to and as an account of transformation. Now, all right. That being the case, it is no wonder that the discipline, the academic discipline of mythic studies has received a tremendous boost and a tremendous insightful, how should we put, insightful movement forward as the result of Jung's work. And Jung, of course, was a German speaker, if you can call Swiss German, Well, I am exaggerating, because the Swiss do speak good German, but with a little accent. But there is also the Schweizerdeutsch, which is a dialect. Now, I assure you that you can be very conversant in Bühnendeutsch, in the literary German, in the German of Goethe and Schiller and so forth, but the Schweizerdeutsch you will not understand. So, there is a difficulty there. But let's say Jung came to be the great influence on I would say, primarily at first the German-speaking intellectual circles in Europe, who already have been stirred up in that fashion by the other German speaker, by the Austrian Sigmund Freud, of course. And so it's no wonder that people in the intellectual and spiritual world perked up their ears once Jung began to put forth his teachings. I would say probably right after about 1913, when one of his works that was sort of a watershed between him and Sigmund Freud was published where the teaching of the archetypes was brought forward. And so obviously the academicians who were interested, really interested at a deep level in this sort of thing, came to Jung and got inspiration from him and from his approach to the psyche for their work. Now, one of these German-speaking academicians, and certainly whose field was mythic studies and Indology, namely of the study of the myths of India, by the name of Heinrich Zimmer, was one of these, and by no means an unimportant one. Now, Jung's attitude to the myth and to mythology is, of course, as I already indicated, most closely affinitized to, let's say, at a practical level, not only on a theoretical, practical level, to that of the mysteries. So to Jung, just like to the votaries of Isis or of the Eleusinian Persephone, Jung held that the so-called story of these heroines and heroes is capable of being re-experienced anew within ourselves. And now, of course, as time goes on, sometimes this is the trouble, that time is a great problem in this world. My friends, the Gnostics, said that time is a counterfeit of eternity, and therefore a great deceiver. In any event, I'm not going to comment on that. I'll let you chew on that yourselves. But let us say, as time went on, obviously various difficulties arose, so that the myths came to be now in our time, in the modern era, in the 20th century, came to be declared as the expressions of what Sigmund Freud already discovered, let us say, the unconscious, das Unbewusste, as we call it in German, which is a somewhat more precise expression than the English word unconscious. Indeed, what he came to call the collective unconscious, or the collective psyche. So the myths are not bowdlerized history, neither are they allegories which need to be explained in terms outside of themselves. Rather, the myths that have not, let's say, died psychologically by having become by having been neglected or lacking in energized meaning, as it were, such living things are the ciphers to the inner meaning of our souls. Now, you know, the study of mythology, of human myth-making, was in deplorable and terrible shape at the time when Jung and his coterie of scholars, or even before, when Jung and his people came on the scene. The ways in which the most famous scholars of the time approached the ancient myths is something deplorable, something terrible. I won't even repeat it because I don't want us to feel so badly about the situation. In any event, one of the interesting and synchronistic circumstances, though, as we moved along in the 20th century and when Jung began to be known in academic and similar circles, that he attracted to himself not only other psychologists, but a whole number, 4 or 5 really great scholars of mythology. And I will deal with the others on subsequent Fridays, but one of the first scholars who was attracted to Jung himself, and who then came to really perform a glorious task during his relatively short life, was Heinrich Zimmer. It's the Z in German is pronounced Z, Zimmer. It's actually Zimmer means a room, but it's just like Schlafzimmer, Badezimmer, things like that. Heinrich Zimmer was born in 1890, right on the, so to say, on the cusp of the 2 centuries, on the shore of the Baltic Sea, in the old university town of Greifswald. He taught at the university in his home city, and later at the universities of Heidelberg and Oxford. In 1939, he met C.G. Jung, and that made an enormous impression on him, and really, as he had said, changed his life and the direction of his studies. So in 1940, only a few years after meeting Jung, and during World War II, Zimmer left Europe and even England to come to the United States. As his principal specialty were the art and philosophy of India. He eventually became a lecturer on these subjects in an aspect of Indology at Columbia University in New York, and while engaged in teaching there, died in 1943, only 3 years after his arrival in the United States, at the untimely age of 53 years. There was no COVID at that time, but there certainly was the influenza and the ensuing pneumonia, and that is what killed Heinrich Zimmer. So his many, as I mentioned, his many notes and lectures, both in German and in English, were then collected and edited in English by his admirer and fellow Jungian Joseph Campbell. His principal published works are and some of these you can still find in print. Philosophies of India, which I have here and you can take a look at. Philosophies of India, myths and symbols of Indian art and civilization. These were all published in the late 40s and very early 50s. The Art of Indian Asia and the King and the Court. These were books that were, with the exception of the King and the Court, which already had been compiled, ready for publication by Heinrich Zimmer. The rest of them were really the only works published by him or with his knowledge. Now, Zimmer was one of the very first scholars to bring a psychological understanding and interpretation to myths as well as to art. He was also distinguished by establishing certain very meaningful guidelines for the connections existing between mythology and art, and last not least, he powerfully pointed out the way philosophy, especially the philosophy of India, was rooted in and connected with mythology. So let's say, unlike the Max Müllers and Monier Williamses and whoever they were, the very famous Indologists of the late 19th century, he not only did not disdain the Puranas, the Puranic literature of India, which I mentioned to him in what it is, in favor of the dry philosophy. These are really the three approaches that I can see, but I have not really concerned myself an awful lot with that subject. Namely, one of them being a dry philosophical approach, the attempt to turn the exotic, the wonderful, the romantic, the wild, the artistic writings of sacred writings of India into a dry, Western, 19th century philosophical, logical categories. I mean, it's a crime what they did. But, you know, there is another one that's not that much of a crime, but it's still a problem. And these are some of the ones that, so it looks to me, today's Indologists confront. So that is one. If you go back to the 19th century approach, oh my God, I mean, you might as well go to Gehenna, you know. But then there is another one, which inadvertently, that is not purposefully, I think was facilitated by the coming of really very valid and very fine and very helpful Indian teachers to Europe and to the United States. Probably the first one being Swami Vivekananda, the disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, the great leader of the late 19th century Vedanta movement in India. Swami Vivekananda came here for the Parliament of the World's Religions at the World Exhibit in Chicago, which was in 889, that would have been 1883, and then we celebrated the centenary of it in 1893 and 1993. So that was the beginning, you know. And then these were these were good people, these were wise people. Certainly Vivekananda was a firebrand of a lecturer, and really came to have the focus the American people's consciousness and mind on India and the concepts of Indian philosophy. He's a very, very great pioneer, and there were others. But what came out eventually of the, let's say, of the guru's journeys to America was that the focus of this kind of Indological involvement came to point itself primarily to meditational practices. Now, this was something that neither Jung nor Heinrich Zimmer were terribly in favor of. And I think for the following reasons, from what I was able to extract from their writings, that if you are not familiar with, or even more than that, are really enmeshed in the mythic milieu of India, not the dry philosophy of the Vedas, and not just meditational practices, but really the Puranic myths. The Puranas are the great mythic poetic works like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. So if you don't do that, then Jung felt, and certainly Heinrich Zimmer seemed to feel, you are likely to miss the motivating spirit in the Indian milieu. You see, meditation divorced from mythology, divorced from ritual, divorced from the culture, is just as partial and fragmentary as a purely intellectual interpretation of the, let's say, of the teaching of the Vedas. And that is why Jung actually put in writing, in the German language, of course, at a certain point, where he warned against people without any adequate interior psycho-spiritual preparation to plunge into meditational practices and into yoga, that they ended up practicing something that in German he called Verdummungsyoga, a yoga of becoming stupid. Now, I love that expression. I tell you, if that was one of his very few expressions, I would adore Jung for it. Because I have met a lot of people in Los Angeles who were practicing and were the result of Verdummungsyoga. So you see, and what the only thing more I'm going to say about this, that everything in this world requires context. There are the two pillars of spiritual philosophy are content and context. The content has to be evaluated within the context. The context will help you to understand the content. And so here is where we, let's say, encountered a big difficulty. Heinrich Zimmer, more than anyone else, tried to address himself to remedying these difficulties by conveying to people in Europe and in America the psycho-spiritual context, the myths, the poetry, the art of India. Because within that context, you may experience some of the spiritual transformation that certainly the religious philosophical milieu of India is designed to accomplish. But if you don't, then you only zero in on a part of it, on a fragment of it, and it will not do you it still might do you some good, but it won't do you as much good as if you had understood the context. And interestingly enough, our time is rushing with us, and I concluded last week when speaking of the great, and I think that he was really a phenomenon, Joseph Campbell. I think if Campbell hadn't come along, the Jung-related, I won't even call it Jungian, but the Jung-related understanding of the spiritual meaning of myths would have been immensely impoverished in any way. But let's say Heinrich Zimmer, in order to indicate, I think, a motivation for people to really immerse themselves in the lore of India in a much more profound manner, that's why he called, maybe or even a slightly I can't find that particular passage. I may come up with it at another time. In any event, there is in one of his, I thought it was in his Philosophies of India book, maybe it's in this one, you look at it very quickly. He introduces himself in the introduction that is Zimmer does. Oh yeah, this is the one. He says that while he was obviously a highly accredited academic, and he only had to leave Germany at the time because he ran afoul of the Nazis, and the details at this moment really don't matter. Yeah, here it is. And he says he's not a scientist. He doesn't want to be called a scientist, that he's divorcing himself from that 19th century intellectual milieu. But he says that what he is, he described himself, it must therefore, he introduces himself as a dilettante. Now, you know, the usual colloquial understanding of a dilettante is that he's somebody who plays around with something, but not in a very serious matter. If you're not a dilettante, you're not a serious whatever you're making out to be. But here is what he says about that. I think this says more about Zimmer than almost anything else. The dilettante, Italian dilettante, present participle of the verb dilettare, to take delight in. So he gives the Italian origin completely. So the dilettante is one who takes delight, diletto, in something. The following essays, which he introduces here in The King and the Corpse, the following essays are for those who take delight in symbols, like conversing with them, and enjoy living with them continually in mind. The moment we abandon this dilettante attitude toward the images of folklore and myth, and begin to feel certain about their proper interpretation. This is, of course, very much the 19th century system. As professional comprehenders, handling the tool of an infallible method. Oh dear, how they remind me of some academics. We deprive ourselves of the quickening contact, the demonic and inspiring assault that is the effect of their intrinsic virtue. We forfeit our proper humility and open-mindedness before the unknown, and refuse to be instructed, refuse to be shown what has never yet quite been told either to us or to anybody else. What a wonderful sentence. And we attempt instead to classify the contents of the dark message under heads and categories already known. This prevents the emergence of any new meaning or fresh understanding, because you're interpreting everything in terms of past verbs. The fairy tale, the childlike legend, namely the message bearer, is methodically regarded as too lowly to merit our submission, both the tale itself and those zones of our nature that respond to it being comparatively unadult. Yet it would have been through the interaction of that outer and this inner innocence that the fertilizing power of the symbol might have been activated and the hidden content disclosed. The method, or rather habit, of reducing the unfamiliar to the well-known is an old way to intellectual frustration. Sterilizing dogmatism is the result. Tightly enwrapped in a mental self-satisfaction, a secure conviction of superiority. Whenever we refuse to be knocked off our feet, either violently or gently, by some telling new conception precipitated from the depths of our imagination by the impact of an ageless symbol, we are cheating ourselves of the fruit of an encounter with the wisdom of the millenniums. It is because they are alive, potent, to revive themselves, and capable of an ever-renewed, unpredictable, yet self-consistent effectiveness in the range of human destiny, that the images of folklore and myth defy every attempt we make at systematization. They are not corpse-like, but imp-like. Corpse is obviously dead, but imp is very much alive. That's the, you might say, the implication of this statement. With a sudden laugh and quick shift of place, they mock the specialist who imagines he has got them pinned to his chart. What they demand of us is not the monologue of a coroner's report, but the dialogue of a living conversation. And just as the hero of the key story of these following stories is brought to a heightened consciousness of himself through the humiliating exchange of words and rescued from a disgraceful, completely odious death, so too may we be instructed, rescued perhaps, and even spiritually transformed. if we will but humble ourselves enough to converse on equal terms with the apparently moribund divinities and folk figures that are hanging multitudinous from a prodigious tree of the past. I think that describes his attitude, his motivating force, and which then expresses itself in the books. I see the majority of which were really compiled from his writings by Joseph Campbell, but I think which is extremely important. So that what we need to keep in mind and maybe take away from here that, out of a country and an academic environment which, let's say, was very much known for its strict and cold rationality, namely the German academia. He came out and eventually came to this country telling us that the important thing is we have to feel for these things. The important thing is the feeling that transforms. Isn't that somewhat similar to what Joseph Campbell said, that the motivating force in transformation is love? Love, feeling. So what these dear people did, they not only pointed out very wonderfully how important these, let's say, these documentations of wisdom in story form are, but what attitude we have to bring to them. We have to learn how to feel about them, maybe the way a lot of children do, and it was precisely in his country where the most rationalistic and moralistic children's tales were written, the Brothers Grimm, which are as grim as you can get because they always have a didactic sense, It's always telling the children, see, if you're not going to behave like this, then you're going to come to an evil end of some kind or the other. So it became a didactic instrumentality, which is not supposed to be. So what we are dealing here with, this field is an inspirational instrumentality. And the fuel of inspiration, just like the fuel that is becoming unbearably expensive now, the mind runs on its own fuel, just like the gasoline engine runs on fuel. And if we don't give it that fuel of feeling, of excitement, of imagination, of enthusiasm, you got to remember, and I conclude on that note, that when we have our own meaning of enthusiasm, but in Greek where that comes from, entheos, being filled with the God. When the God takes possession of you, then you are entheos, and you are enthusiastic. So when we are enthusiastic, the gods are working through us. When we are not, they won't. And that is why all the things that go against your enthusiasm, that kill your spirit, that take the poetry and the beauty of life and reduce it to some irreducible minimum, these things you should avoid. What makes you excited, what makes you enthusiastic, that is where the gods, that is where the heroes, that is where the hero will journey into you. That is the important thing. And these dear people, Heinrich Zimmer and certainly his disciple Joseph Campbell, they understood that very, very well, and I have never, obviously, he was here such a short time, and my first book that I bought of his was The Philosophies of India. I bought it at the Vedanta Society bookstore up here long time ago. So I certainly couldn't have had any contact with him, but I certainly saw it in Campbell and in others. This is extremely important, and I tell you, this is, if anything is going to save this civilization, it is certainly not going to be one country attacking another, but it's also not going to be a lot of things that are happening. But this will. Because this does not come from the experts. This does not come from the people who say, oh, well, we have these degrees and we are sitting in our chair and therefore we know everything. But they come from a very, very wise person. And where is that wise person? Inside of you. When it comes from there, and when the enthusiasm is there, and when when these things happen, then the process is moving and the transformation is happening, and this is which will transform us and will transform perhaps our poor, beat up and miserably managed culture as well, and then there may still be hope for this old world, which I hope and pray is the case, and thank you very much.